I was doing a session with a client of mine recently who's a leader of a large enough organization. And I thought I'd share some of that conversation with you because I think it's something that most people can relate to. And I think it's an important conversation, especially in terms of trying to help somebody make a change, a positive change in a work context. But it also relates to life. Anyway, this leader had received some very serious news in their job, and how he reacted was very different to how he would have reacted a few months ago before we started, I guess, working together. So he told me that he recognized that, if the same news, which was fairly significant on a big project that's important to him and his business, if it had happened a few months earlier, he would have panicked. He would have thrown his toys out of the pram, and he would have created other problems. He told me that he's aware that in the other version of him, his mind would have raced towards the consequences, the worst case consequences. But instead, this time for him, something different happened. The initial reaction came. So he was tense, slight panic. That came almost instantaneously when he got this bad news. But what was interesting was he didn't follow the thinking. He didn't follow the feeling. He actually said mentally slowed down and slightly mentally detached from what his inner voice was saying, and even the panicky feelings and thoughts that came with the initial reaction. Now, we kind of were discussing what had actually happened. And in that context, he said, after he calmed himself down, he looked then at the situation with a clear head, what I call a 3C mind: calm, clear, connected, or centered. And then he saw the next appropriate action to take. But at the same time, what he also was aware of, he noticed that his team around him were also calming down. They were responding to him, because I suppose he's now aware that his mood, how he is contagious, especially if you're the leader. So he kind of realized in our conversation that, I used to think that how I reacted to those kind of situations was just who I am, that, I might get angry, I might shout, I might bang the table. I just thought that was who I was. But that also created other problems because people would react to it, they'd shut down, they'd get worried themselves. And I think millions of people believe exactly that they might think, well, I'm a worrier, that's who I am. Or I'm hot-headed, that's who I am. Or I'm an overthinker, that's who I am. Or I don't handle pressure well, or I'm just wired this way. But what if that's not who you are at all? Because in my mind, that's not who you are. Now, I think an element around that I want to talk about is that I think you might find this strange for someone like me to say this, but I don't believe you can control your mind. I think most people think that mental strength means getting better at controlling your thoughts and your emotions, but I'm convinced that's the wrong game. You can't completely control what thought arrives. Think about it, you can't. I mean, the most random stuff appears in my mind. And also, if something happens that scares you, you can't stop that initial surge of fear. In many ways, it's a instantaneous biological response. You can't necessarily guarantee that anger won't appear if something threatens you or annoys you. And you certainly can't decide that you're going to wake up tomorrow feeling 9 out of 10 all the time. And I've been living and working in this space for 30 years, and I can't do that either. Now, I used to think that maybe that's what you could do because people told me you could. But I realized with experience that was BS, because they didn't. And to try and control your mind is so exhausting. It's a waste of energy. And there's a much easier way. There's a much better way. Because what you can become much better at that is effective is not automatically following where your mind wants to take you. Now, in the context of talking to my client, and increasingly, I suppose, as I'm doing other things, there's a couple of modes or concepts that I want to share. I call it here and there. Now, I use them in different ways for different things. But here mode to me is when you have that 3C mind, calm, clear, centered, it means you're more present, you're more aware, you're more responsive, you're more in free flow thought. And when you're in there mode, it's more that you're lost in your thinking. You're thinking, you're probably more analytical, but you're kind of gone into loops without realizing it. And that's actually where I think most of the world is most of the time, because they don't really understand the importance of the distinction between the two modes. But actually, weirdly, by getting better at being in here mode, weirdly, you seem to get better, in my experience, at getting to wherever you want to get to, achieving the goals you want to create, being at your best more often. Now, just to give an example, let's just say an important email comes in, and maybe it's from somebody important in your work life or your personal life. Just, can we talk? That's it. Your mind, what will it do? For a lot of people, it'll immediately race to scenarios, what I'm going to call they. So you go into their mode. Okay, maybe that person is unhappy. Maybe we're losing the account. Maybe I've screwed something up. Maybe there's going to be an unwelcome problem. Maybe it's going to affect my cash. That's all gone into analytical what-if scenarios, which I'm going to call their mode. I'm kind of lost in my mind without almost realizing it. Now, in many ways, it's completely normal as a human. But there is a difference between going into their mode in that context, what I would say, like visiting their, you can kind of look at thinking about what you want to do, having a good meeting, being present. That's a good use of thinking. And their mode, well, it's a fine place to visit. It's a bad place to live. Here mode is a much better place to live because you're calm, clear, present. In that mode, you're much more responsive to what happens in the moment. You've access to your intuition. You're more adaptable in the moment as opposed to being lost in your head, lost in your thinking, which is what I'm calling their mode. So going back to my client, the breakthrough for him was that it wasn't that he didn't react. He did. He actually did react initially. He said, his nervous system registered problem, danger. He told me his shoulders, he could feel them raising, getting tight. He could feel himself getting angry. He could feel himself getting worried. And his mind, as a result, started generating not pleasant consequences. But then he recognized that as a here versus there moment. And instead of going into trying to solve an imagined future, an imagined negative future as it was in this case, he calmed himself down, moved back into 3C mind, went into here mode, got more present, and then he dealt with the actual present. And that's the skill. That's the inner skill. Just to give you an analogy, if you think about, okay, how do I control my thoughts, Shane? I'm going to say, okay, you don't. So to help that, imagine your mind is a sky, is the sky. So your thoughts and emotions are the weather. And sometimes you have a clear blue sky. There's no clouds. But sometimes there is cloud. Sometimes there's a lot of clouds. Sometimes there's half cloud, half blue sky. Sometimes there's really dark clouds. And then sometimes a thunderstorm arises out of nowhere. And for years, you could maybe describe yourself as someone who just flies around inside the sky trying to manage the weather. I'm going to try and stop that cloud. I'm going to try and fix this one. I'm going to try and get rid of that feeling. I'm going to try and think positively and bring good clouds in. I'll get rid of clouds. I'm going to try and calm myself down. But even describing it as exhausting. And the breakthrough, I think, can happen. It might happen for you today is when you start to really realize that you're not the weather. You're the one that notices the weather. And that is the deeper teaching underneath what I'm calling here mode. So what that means then is that you don't have to clear the storm before you can act intelligently. And that's really, really important. And in many ways there, very practical thing is to see your body like a GPS system. You could check in with it to see, is it loose or is it tight? Is it tense? Is it relaxed? It's a very simple but powerful way to really check with yourself. And I've learned to use that simple mechanism or approach in terms of how I feel as feedback rather than as something that I need to fix. So I don't mind if I get tight or agitated or defensive or rushed or even insecure. I used to. I just think that was a weakness. Now I don't. I see it as, okay, I'm just human. Things like that can happen. But what it does tell me, it's feedback from my GPS system. It's saying, Shane, you've actually disappeared into the clouds. I'm not saying to myself something is terribly wrong that needs to be fixed. I'm just saying to myself, oh, I've obviously gotten caught up with some thinking here. And then it's a reminder for me to come back to here and maybe ask yourself some questions that might help in terms of, okay, hang on, what's actually true here? versus what I'm imagining, or what's actually happening, or what needs my attention right now in the next 5 minutes, in the next half an hour, in the next hour. That they're much cleaner, progressive questions. So just for yourself, 2 simple questions to think about. Like, where in your life, where in your work might you be currently in dare mode, kind of lost in your thinking? And, not merely thinking about something, but actually literally lost in thinking about your thinking, if that makes sense. And then the second question is like, what would change if you stopped trying to solve your entire future and instead, all those what ifs, all those worries, instead you just went, you know what, for today, for the next hour, for the next day, for the next week, for the next month, I'm just going to deal with what's here, like what's actually real in front of me. And again, just so we're clear, because I think it's very easy to kind of misunderstand some of what we're talking about today. You don't need to become somebody who never gets stressed. That's not reality. Shane gets stressed, but I'm okay with that. You don't need to stop difficult thoughts appearing. You don't need perfect control of your emotions. That's not freedom. That's more like being like a robot, and it's not realistic. And it's exhausting trying to do it. Freedom to me, like true mental freedom, is recognizing that a thought can appear without having to follow it. So like a storm can arrive, and they will arrive without you becoming the storm. You can visit there without getting lost there. And maybe that's one of the greatest mental skills any leader, any sports person, anybody can develop, is knowing when to come back to here, like knowing how to come back to here. Come back to that clear mind, quiet mind, even with a busy, ambitious life. And just to close out, you don't control the weather in your mind, but you don't have to live inside every storm either. That's it for this week. Ciao for now.